There is a particular kind of silence that descends over a basketball nation when its most important player begins to belong, irrevocably and officially, to somewhere else. The Philippines knows that silence. They are living inside it right now. Kai Sotto, 7 feet, 3 inches of Filipino hope, the tallest native son the archipelago has ever produced, has completed the process that makes him a naturalized player under Australian basketball law. The NBL has acknowledged it. The paperwork is real. And the ripple effects of that single administrative fact are spreading outward through the sport's global landscape the way a stone disturbs still water. Visibly, inevitably, and farther than most people initially expect. To understand why this moment lands so hard, you have to go back to the summer of 2021. A 19-year-old, impossibly long and still growing into his own wingspan, touched down in Adelaide wearing a smile that contained equal parts confidence and anxiety. The NBL had welcomed him under its special restricted player provision, a cleverly constructed mechanism that allowed the league to count Asian players as domestic talent, expanding its regional footprint while simultaneously giving players like Sotto a professional platform. He was not there as an import. He was treated, under the league's own rules, like a local. And now, 5 years later, what began as a contractual designation has become something far more permanent. Permanent and complicated. Think about what the Philippines had been banking on. Their pipeline of elite, NBA-caliber big men is not exactly overflowing. Mar Fajardo is beloved, but his game was always built for a different era and a slower tempo. The naturalization of Justin Brownlee gave Gilas a versatile wing who could compete at the Paris Olympics, a moment that felt genuinely transformative for Philippine basketball. But there was always an assumption, held quietly and fiercely, that Sotto would be the generational centerpiece of the Gilas program for the next decade. The 7-footer who could anchor a defense, stretch the floor from the high post, and give the Philippines a physical presence they have never truly possessed at the senior international level. That assumption is now, at minimum, complicated. And at maximum, it is gone. Coach Tim Cone, the American-born basketball mind who has won more PBA championships than any coach in Philippine professional history, a man whose tactical intelligence and emotional intelligence run in roughly equal measure, has been characteristically measured in his public response. He has a solution, his camp says. He is already working on it. Knowing Cone, that is probably true. He has spent his career finding solutions in places where other coaches see only problems. But the nature of this particular problem deserves to be examined carefully before we accept reassurances, however well earned. The NBL's naturalization mechanism did not arrive in isolation. It exists within a broader global conversation about basketball nationality, player eligibility, and the way international federations have struggled, sometimes clumsily, to keep pace with a sport that has become genuinely and irreversibly worldwide. Lester Prosper was naturalized as Indonesian. Andre Blatch became a Filipino. Jordan Clarkson waited out the residency requirement and put on the Philippine jersey at the Paris Games. The idea that an elite young player born in one country might eventually choose to represent another, whether for competitive, professional, or personal reasons, is no longer shocking. It is, increasingly, simply basketball. What makes the Sotto situation different is the specific texture of what's being lost and what's potentially being gained, on both sides of the Pacific. Let us begin with the anatomy of the player himself, because the tactical conversation is the one that matters most. Kai Sotto is, physically, a once-in-a-generation anomaly for Southeast Asian basketball. Standing 7 feet 3 inches and weighing in the range of 230 to 240 pounds with his current frame, a frame that has filled out considerably since those raw, angular Adelaide days, he occupies a positional space that the modern NBA has come to treasure, the mobile, shooting-capable center who can protect the rim without clogging the paint. His shot chart has improved meaningfully over his years in Japan's B-League. The numbers from his 2024-25 season with Kashigaya, before the ACL tore through his left knee in January 2025, showed a player averaging 13.8 points and 9.6 rebounds per game, not against second-division competition, but against a league that has quietly become one of the more physically credible professional environments outside of North America. The B-League is not the NBA. Nobody is claiming it is. But it is a legitimate proving ground, and Sotto was proving things in it. The ACL. That word hangs over everything. Anterior cruciate ligament tears are, for a center of Sotto's dimensions, something qualitatively different than they are for a guard or a wing. The landing mechanics required of a 7-foot player, the geometry of how a body that tall absorbs contact, navigates the pivot foot under the basket, establishes position, creates stresses that ACL rehabilitation protocols were not originally designed around. The timeline is longer. The compensatory patterns learned during recovery can linger in the neuromuscular system for 18 months after return to play. When Sotto came back in January 2026 and, almost comically cruel in its timing, rolled his ankle on his 10th minute of his first game back, the basketball-watching world understood that the road to full physical authority was still incomplete. And yet, the reports from within the Kashigaya Alpha's training environment in the weeks before his return described a player who had approached rehabilitation with a seriousness that quieted the doubters inside the organization. He set a career-high 19 rebounds in a B-League game in late March 2026. 19 rebounds. From a man 8 months removed from ACL surgery. That is not a rehabilitation story. That is a re-emergence story. Those are different things. So what does this mean tactically for the NBL, the league he is now permanently tied to at the classification level? The NBL has, over the past decade, evolved into one of the most tactically sophisticated competitions outside the NBA. The transition began when Larry Kestelman took control of the league in 2015 and, through a combination of financial restructuring and aggressive pursuit of high-profile talent, most memorably LaMelo Ball in 2019 and Illawarra, transformed a competition that was genuinely fighting for survival into one that NBA front offices now genuinely monitor. When LaMelo arrived, the NBL set attendance and viewership records. The comparison drawn by Commissioner Jeremy Lowe-Liger between LaMelo's arrival and Kai Sotto's signing in 2021 was not merely promotional. The Filipino-Australian community is vast, passionate, and basketball-mad in a way that fills arenas. The crowds at Margaret Court Arena when Australia hosted the Philippines in a FIBA qualifier, Lowe-Liger described it years later with something close to awe, were overwhelmingly Filipino. They sang, they chanted, they turned an Australian home game into a visiting team's fortress. Now, those same fans may one day watch Sotto in green and gold. The implications for Gilas Pilipinas are severe, and they deserve to be stated plainly rather than softened. The Philippines' most physically dominant big man, the one player who gave their national team a credible answer to the Patty Mills and Joe Ingles generations of the Australian boomers, may no longer be available to them. And the timing is not incidental. The 2027 FIBA Basketball World Cup qualification process is underway. The Philippines is navigating it without Sotto already, having declared himself unavailable for the February window against New Zealand and Australia. Australia, the country now claiming his basketball identity, defeated Gilas in the FIBA Asia Cup quarterfinals last year with something approaching ease. The Boomers, even in transition, even without multiple NBA contributors who have stepped back from international duty, are a physically superior team to what the Philippines can assemble without a healthy Sotto. Coach Cone understood this viscerally. He likened a Sotto-less Gilas to a San Miguel team without Junmar Fajardo, a usable comparison, but one that, if anything, understates the problem, because Fajardo was always surrounded by PBA-caliber depth. At the international level, the position differential is existential. Here is what Tim Cone's solution must be, if it is going to be a real solution rather than a motivational construction. Cone, with his multiple PBA championships, his deep familiarity with building teams around systemic principles rather than individual gifts, will need to fundamentally reconceptualize how Gilas competes against elite international opposition. His naturalization of Brownlee was a stroke of strategic genius, a 6 feet 6 inches wing with NBA-adjacent lateral quickness who could defend multiple positions, handle the ball in transition, and score in isolation. The Boatright naturalization that has been working its way through the Philippine Congress represents another piece of the puzzle, a more traditional big, a rim presence, a rebounder. But neither Brownlee nor Boatright gives Gilas what Sotto uniquely represented, a shot-altering presence at center that legitimately matched up with the world's best frontlines. Cone's solution, then, almost certainly has to be schematic. He has always been a coach who designs around constraints rather than complaining about them. His Princeton-influenced motion offenses over the years generated scoring for players who had no business scoring that efficiently. He will likely push Gilas toward a style that de-emphasizes interior dominance, more pace, more perimeter creation, more switching on defense rather than drop coverage, more reliance on the athleticism of naturalized wings and Filipino guards who are, genuinely, among the most skilled guards in Asia. Javi Gomez de Leano. CJ Perez. The next generation of PBA players who grew up watching Sotto and now have to figure out how to win without him. There is one question that nobody in Philippine basketball wants to ask publicly, but that the honest observer has to confront directly. Was the naturalization inevitable? Consider the Kai Sotto arrived in Adelaide at 19 under a special restricted player designation that essentially made him a de facto local. He won back-to-back fans MVP awards from the NBL's audience, an audience that was largely Filipino, it must be said, but that nonetheless reflects a genuine connection to Australian basketball culture. He spent formative professional years living in Adelaide, building relationships, understanding the rhythms of the Australian game. When he left for Japan, it was not because he had rejected Australia. It was because the B-League offered him more playing time and a path to the NBA that wasn't materializing in the NBL context. The connection to Australia never severed. It deepened at the legal and administrative level while he was competing elsewhere. Naturalization, in this reading, is less a betrayal than a formalization of something that had been building since April of 2021. The Philippine Basketball Association has, over the years, wrestled with the contradictions inherent in claiming players who are simultaneously pursuing careers that serve only their individual development. The SBP, the Samahang Basketball ng Pilipinas, has been gracious in its public statements about Sotto's choices, including his decision to potentially pursue NCAA college basketball in the United States at 23 years old. Ricky Vargas, the SBP president, said something genuinely moving when asked about Sotto's NBA dream. His dream is our dream, too. And that is almost certainly sincere. Philippine basketball wants Kai Sotto to make the NBA. If he does so while carrying an Australian passport, the celebration will be complicated by grief. Because here is the thing about the NBA dream, and about why it still exists for a player who has been undrafted, injured, and redirected multiple times. Sotto's physical profile has not become less remarkable simply because his professional record has not been straightforward. At 7 feet 3 inches with the ability to step out and shoot from the mid-range and high post, with shot-blocking instincts that produced 2.5 blocks per 36 minutes in his best B-League stretch, with footwork that has noticeably improved since his NBL days, he remains a profile that NBA front offices are not equipped to ignore indefinitely. The league has never been more desperate for legitimate mobile big men who can protect the rim without compromising floor spacing. Victor Wembanyama's arrival changed the ceiling of what scouts understand to be possible at center. It also, paradoxically, expanded interest in other 7-footers who showed even partial echoes of that skill set. Sotto is not Wembanyama. Nobody is. But the conversation about what a skilled mobile center can do in the modern NBA has become richer, more nuanced, and more interested in outliers than at any point in the past 30 years. The Australian naturalization, if it genuinely accelerates Sotto's path back to NBL competition at a higher level, as a full local player rather than under a specialized designation, may be exactly the competitive environment he needs to make the final case to NBA evaluators. The NBL's best competition is not G-League competition. The finishing, the defensive IQ, the positional understanding required to survive against NBL veterans who have played in multiple top leagues, these are real demands. If Sotto can dominate that competition over a full season while fully healthy, the 2027 NBA draft conversation changes. He would be 25 years old. That is not too old. Bill Walton played his first NBA Finals at 24. Hakeem Olajuwon was 22 at his first All-Star selection, but the player he became, the polished, layered, supremely intelligent center, did not fully arrive until his late 20s. Comparison is not prediction. But the history of centers developing on longer timelines than guards or wings is unambiguous. Now step back. Farther. Stand at the distance from which the shape of the next decade becomes visible. What this moment represents, beyond the individual biography of one young man from Las Piñas, is the acceleration of a globalization process that basketball has been struggling to govern coherently for 2 decades. FIBA's eligibility rules, the NBA's international pathways, the NBL's special restricted player mechanism, the Philippines' naturalization of foreign-born players, all of these systems are, in their different ways, attempts to manage a sport that has outgrown the national borders within which it was originally organized. Players move. Passports follow, or they precede, or they accompany choices that are primarily economic, occasionally political, and sometimes simply personal. The idea that a single young man born in the Philippines should be permanently obligated to represent it at every stage of his professional life, regardless of where his career takes him, regardless of what opportunities present themselves, is a romantically appealing notion. It is also, increasingly, a fantasy that the sport cannot sustain. What Australia gains is not merely a player. They gain a symbol. A 7 feet 3 inches center who was the center of gravity for the most basketball-obsessed nation in Southeast Asia, now wearing Australian colors, potentially marching into FIBA competitions against the very country that raised him. The Boomers have always been a proud program. They won their first Olympic medal in Tokyo. They have produced Patty Mills and Andrew Bogut and Ben Simmons and Dante Exum and half the players who have defined the NBL's credibility for a generation. Adding a naturalized Sotto to that infrastructure, to a Boomers roster that will be rebuilt around the next generation of Australian NBA talent, would represent something genuinely new in the history of their program. And what the Philippines loses cannot be fully catalogued in statistics or roster projections. You lose a symbol of a different kind. The specific hope that the country would produce, from within its own soil, a player capable of competing on the world's largest stage without the qualifying asterisk of naturalization. That hope was always fragile. It was always dependent on a single young man's health and trajectory and choices. But it was real, and it was held by millions of people for whom basketball is not entertainment but identity. Tim Cone will find his solutions. He always does. He is too experienced and too intelligent to let structural loss become existential defeat. The Philippines will qualify for what they need to qualify for. They will compete. They will, on certain nights against certain opponents in the right building with the right crowd, be genuinely dangerous. But the game has a way of making visible what we most want to avoid seeing. Somewhere, in some future FIBA qualifying window or perhaps at a World Cup, Kai Sotto is going to walk onto a court in green and gold. He will be taller than almost everyone on the floor. He will warm up with his characteristic deliberateness, the long arms moving through their full range, the footwork patterns that coaches in Adelaide and Hiroshima and Kashigaya all worked on with him, one season at a time. And across the court, in blue, there will be players who grew up watching him, who cheered for him, who told their children his name. What happens in that moment, that specific, charged, irreducible human moment, is something that no eligibility rule and no coaching solution and no amount of tactical preparation can fully address. The sport's beauty, and its occasional cruelty, is that it keeps manufacturing exactly those moments. And then it makes you live inside them. The question of what Kai Sotto's career ultimately becomes, NBA player, naturalized boomer, enduring symbol of the Philippines' most bittersweet basketball saga, or some combination of all three, remains genuinely open. He is 23 years old. He is recovering from the worst injury a basketball player can sustain. He has already made more professional detours than most players his age have taken steps. And he is still, by any reasonable physical assessment, a player whose ceiling has not been reached. Maybe that is the thing that lingers. Not the grief of what the Philippines loses, or the calculation of what Australia gains, or even the tactical puzzles that Tim Cone must solve with incomplete pieces. What lingers is the sheer unresolved nature of the story. Kai Sotto's best basketball may not have been played yet. The place where it gets played, what country it represents, what colors it wears, what flag goes up when he finally fulfills the promise that everyone who has watched him has always intuited, that remains, as of this moment, genuinely unknown. That kind of uncertainty is rare. In a sport where so much is projected and predicted and analyzed before it ever happens, a player who still holds this many open questions at this stage of his career is, almost paradoxically, the most interesting kind. We are watching. We do not yet know what we are watching toward.